Boss fights are probably one of the most memorable moments across every genre of video games, from the ups and downs, the hundreds of deaths, and just that final moment when you finally beat the boss. It definitely holds a special place in your heart, and I'm sure it holds a lot of nostalgia for a lot of us. So on today's list, we're going to be going over the top 5 most satisfying boss fights. And now, satisfying not in the sense of they're super duper hard or anything like that, but these are definitely boss fights that you will remember from the past that definitely brought you a lot of emotions, maybe bad, maybe good, and that I think everyone in gaming just kind of shared together. So starting off at number 1, it's the guy with the really long sword that if you never played Final Fantasy, you probably didn't know who he was. And that's gonna be the Sepiroth boss fight in Kingdom Hearts 2. I can remember this boss fight vividly. This was a huge part of, I think, a lot of people's childhoods. And when you think of Kingdom Hearts, you probably don't think of crazy difficult boss fights or anything like this, but the Sepiroth boss fight is probably one of the more mechanically challenging boss fights that I've done in a long time. On top of the fact that you really needed to grind like 60 to 70 levels just to have the abilities and skills to actually have a fighting chance. I mean, look at all those health bars. We love to see it. This boss fight is easily one of the most talked about boss fights. And if you had beat Sepiroth, you were just the dude. You were the person. Everyone always was like, wow. I know there was a lot of us that probably went through this 10 to 15 to 20 times before we finally got that dub. And that was one of the most satisfying boss fight victories that I had had in a long time. And to this day, when I thought about doing this video, this was the first thing that popped into my head. Between the several different fighting mechanics in this boss fight, the reactions that you needed, as well as just the length and duration that the boss fight took, this is easily one of my top 10s. Moving on to number 2 is going to be a wonderful boss fight from Dark Souls that I'm sure everybody remembers, and that is going to be Ornstein Smough. Now, these two were a giant pain in the butt, I have to say. Going in on the first fight, and maybe you are lucky enough to get one of them down, and you had no idea that there might be a specific order that you want to take these guys down in, because one's a little bit harder than the other one when they get powered up. I'll always remember the first time that I brought one down, and then their brother just turned into this giant monster that pretty much just not exactly one-shot me, but I really didn't have a chance. And I feel like that was a common occurrence that a lot of us went through. At the time, I don't think I could have imagined defeating this boss without using a Spectre. And to everyone that did, props to you. Defeating these two was definitely a highlight of just the Dark Souls series, in my opinion, as well as a very rewarding and happy time once you finally got both of them down. Between learning the mechanics, deciding which order you wanted to take them down in, and then finally getting through both HP bars, it was extremely rewarding. Moving on to number 3, this boss probably brought you to the "you died" screen more times than anything else that you've probably fought before, and that's going to be Malenia. Elden Ring, obviously, fantastic game of the year, has an amazing world with a lot of amazing bosses, but Malenia really brought it to you in a different way, I feel like, for a lot of us. This is definitely one of the most talked about bosses in this game, and it's definitely the one that killed you the most. On release, this was definitely the boss fight that everyone enjoyed the most, because getting through this boss fight was so satisfying, both just because of difficulty, and secondly, because this was just the one that most people struggled with, so it definitely gave you that feeling of satisfaction when you finally got through. I remember when I got to this boss, getting through the first phase was really not anything too crazy. I mean, once you got the mechanics down, you had a pretty decent shot of getting through that first HP bar. And I remember when I got to the second stage and I was like, holy shit, no wonder the first part was so much easier. So I'm sure when we were all finally able to get through that second health bar, you probably put your controller down, stood up, did one of those victory walks in a circle, and told your whole Discord, because that was one of the most satisfying feelings I've had in a long time. Moving on to number 4, one of the most action-packed series and just gorgeous-looking series. That's going to be God of War, and this is going to be the Sigrun boss fight, the Valkyrie Queen. Now, this was a boss that you needed to 100% the game, and to get this done you had to go around and defeat all of the other Valkyries before you could finally summon their queen. Now, this boss fight had a lot of familiar mechanics from all of the other Valkyries, but it dealt significantly more damage, so there was a lot to get used to. As always, I feel like God of War does a fantastic job with its boss fights, from the animations to the mechanics and just the overall just gorgeous scenery during a boss fight. It's less stressful, I feel like, than most other games because it just is so interactive and beautiful. However, this boss fight was definitely a giant pain in the butt, but it definitely had one of the best execution animations at the end of the boss fight, and for those achievement hunters, this was definitely a fantastic feeling when you finally got through this boss. Moving on to number 5, this is gonna be one of those just larger than life boss fights that, while not extremely difficult, definitely just gave you a huge feeling of awe and amazement, and that's going to be Phalanx from Shadow of Colossus. Now, Shadow of Colossus, every single one of the bosses in this game give you that larger than life feeling, with most of them feeling more like a puzzle than a boss fight, and that's just due to the ginormous size of the bosses. Generally, you were calling around on them, having to do some type of interaction to finally defeat the boss. It wasn't your general, here's a giant HP bar, try and get through it as I change my mechanics. It was definitely a special type of boss fight, and Phalanx, I feel like, gave you that ginormous open world feeling. It was in itself a very simple boss fight, but it was also extremely majestic and beautiful. And while maybe it didn't make you struggle and you didn't die 100 times here, it was definitely a scene that you will remember when you think of boss fights in the future. And I feel like that is one of the most important things that a boss fight can do for you in video games. It's just giving you something to remember and giving you that nostalgia when you think of it again. Now, I know this is just a top 5, but we're going to move into some honorable mentions because I feel like there's some bosses that you can't really not think about when you think about boss fights in video games. And the first one is going to be Bowser. Bowser's been around for so long, since the early 80s, and his evolution has been fantastic. He's definitely one of those memorable characters across just the whole series and video games in general, and I feel like Bowser deserves the recognition for just being a fantastic boss that has been around through all of our lives. Next, we have Ganon. Same thing like Bowser, Ganon has been around for so long across so many different games in the Zelda series, and I feel like he's been a fantastic antagonist throughout the whole series, and just like Bowser, definitely deserves the recognition for being a boss that has been around with us through our whole life and giving us a lot of difficult challenges, as well as kicking the shit out of us in Smash Bros. Quite literally. Next, while it's not exactly a boss fight, I feel like the Elite Four from Pokemon is just one of those things that everyone has some type of memory from. While we might not all have continued playing the games through, I know most of us have played the first few. Blue, Red, Gold, Silver, Crystal, all the early games, and I feel like the Elite Four holds a special place for a lot of us. Whether you actually evenly trained your whole team, or you just went through with your starter because that's just what you're supposed to do. I'm sure we all have some fantastic memories with all of these games, regardless of where you stopped, and I feel like Pokemon and the Elite Four deserve some recognition here in regards to boss fights. Next, this is another one that's not exactly a boss fight, but I feel like this is something that every single person that's played video games pretty much can think of, and that's gonna be Through the Fire and the Flames from Guitar Hero. This was easily one of the most difficult songs in Guitar Hero history. I feel like a lot of us have a lot of fun memories playing this, and going over to your friend's house playing Guitar Hero, trying to do 100% on expert, things of that nature. I remember vividly having one of my friends put a rubber band around the green button because I had no idea that you didn't really need to press the green button. You could just hold it down the whole time. And that's how a lot of these people were actually getting these crazy, crazy expert runs. And I just thought I was bad. Not that that really made it that much easier, but it definitely made this song in particular maybe like 1 or 2% easier. But this song was fantastic regardless of what difficulty you played it on. Between the difficulty of fingers, as well as just the ridiculously long song time, Through the Fire and the Flames I think will go down as the best song in Guitar Hero history, and I feel like it deserves to be here in the honorable mentions. And then lastly, one that's a little near and dear because I think I just loved the Assassin's Creed series up until Black Flag. And that's going to be the assassination of Pope Rodrigo in Assassin's Creed 2. If you're like me, Ezio Auditore holds a lot of special memories in your head and in your heart. I think this was one of the most unique game series growing up that taught you a lot about some silly history that, while not exactly true in the game, still gave you food for thought, basically. Might make you look things up. And while this boss fight wasn't really exactly difficult, I feel like this was the peak of the story in this game, and it really just closed everything out for you while also leaving you a cliffhanger for the next game. And it definitely gave you a lot of satisfaction when you finally got to put this guy to rest for all of the terrible things that he had done. And that's going to be everything, guys. I know there is a metric ton of bosses that probably deserve to be on this list. And if you have anyone that you particularly really have a lot of memories for, or just a lot of satisfaction when you finally defeated the boss, definitely let me know down below. I think for me, the boss that probably is the closest to my heart is actually the last boss fight in Jak 3. I actually never beat Jak 3 when I was younger. The last boss fight was too difficult. And this is around the time when I finally got an Xbox 360, so I didn't really play my PS2 too much anymore. We actually ended up doing the dumbest thing I've ever done probably in my life, and that was gave our PS2 away to a family friend, as well as our hundreds of PS2 games that we had collected over our life. I deeply regret that forever, but 20 years later, I actually played through all of the Jak series in one sitting. It was a whopping 34 hours, and that boss in Jak 3 was just super easy. And that just reminds me of how bad I used to be at video games. I was really cracking up in it. So for me, the final boss of Jak 3 is definitely the most nostalgic, satisfying boss fight I had ever done. Let me know what yours was down below. If this is the type of content that you would prefer to see on this channel, definitely let me know down below as well. Likes and subscribes are always appreciated, and I hope to see you on the next one.